Okay, up next is carbon capture and sequestration from the emitter's perspective, brought to us by Charles Fridge and Megan Skiba. Charles is the chairman and CEO of Verde CO2. He's a seasoned energy executive with 30 years of business management and legal expertise. Throughout his career, he has founded and managed a variety of midstream and upstream oil and gas companies with a continual emphasis on business profitability. Charles oversees and manages the project identification, development, and operational teams at Verde. He specializes in origination of Verde's projects, business management, capital allocation, asset profitability, private partnership structuring, and tax equity agreements. Megan is an associate in the Pittsburgh office of Reed Smith. She focuses her practice on representing energy clients, primarily in the upstream oil and gas and carbon capture and sequestration sectors, which makes sense because she's speaking here today. Megan counsels energy clients on matters involving acquisitions and dispositions, joint ventures, CCUS project development, oil and gas and pore space leasing, corporate governance, project development, distressed asset sales, and a variety of other areas. She's a graduate of the University of Pitt and the University of Pitt School of Law.
Great, so thanks for the introduction. Charles, as was mentioned, you're a recovering lawyer and you spent more than a decade as an oil and gas executive. I know that we're seeing a lot of oil and gas professionals driving the CCS industry. Just curious what you're attributing that to, and kind of wanted to know a little more about what brought you specifically to CCS, and if you could tell us a little more about Verde.
Sure, no problem. Kind of I'll work in that order of questions. Definitely the drive from oil and gas professionals, not only being upstream drillers and geoscientists, but midstream companies as well as process engineers with capture equipment that we traditionally have used, aiming-based, cooling towers and separation equipment in the oil field. It requires the same skill set, and frankly, that's how Verde began. That's a pretty fairly decent segue into how Verde began. We're an oil and gas company in this building years ago, a private oil and gas company. Our financial partner then, one of the larger insurance companies in the United States, was a limited partner in our company, and they made a corporate decision to get out of hydrocarbon investing entirely, and notified me that we had to figure out a way to sell all of our assets, most of which at the time were in West Texas. And when that occurred, after I got out of the fetal position from underneath my desk for a few days, I thought, how am I going to keep all these folks employed? We spent a lot of time looking at a host of opportunities and decided really to write what you know or paint what you know. And we initially had looked at doing enhanced oil and gas recovery and availing ourselves to low carbon fuel credits under the innovative fuel standard in California and with oil fields as far as Wyoming. And then in talking to potential financial partners for Verde, decided to move to pure sequestration, which is what we ended up doing. And that's how Verde began back in 2019, before, frankly, we really didn't have line of sight to how we were going to make this a business. In fact, initially, 45Q was difficult. It had been around for a time, but it was difficult to ascertain who earned the credits. It was all tax equity partnerships, which we were familiar with as lawyers, or I was, from solar and onshore wind. But 45Q prior to January 6th of 2021, Treasury hadn't given us any bright line rules. And then we've learned it was a capture company. So initially, Verde was built under the premise that emitters, once we moved away from oil field byproducts to point source emitters, would, we believe, pay us to meet their corporate directives. So that's a little bit of how Verde started back in 19 and 20, and then obviously 21 changed things quite a bit. And I think every year we've evolved. Obviously, the Inflation Reduction Act has made a large change.
Great. Well, thank you for the background. So let's talk a bit about what these projects look like from a business perspective. So I know that these talks are virtual and some may be seeing this after other sessions, but could you tell everybody a little bit more about the business framework for a CCS project? At a high level, what are the key components in a typical project?
Sure, absolutely. And, I think we had discussed this before, and I know that the lawyers at Reed Smith that we've worked with for a long time have seen the evolution of this since our business model was started. You know, obviously there's a capture of CO2, which is one of the key components, then the transportation to the actual site via midstream, and then obviously the downhole aspect, which used to be called upstream, now downstream, I suppose, is a different component of it as well. A lot of our projects, in fact, up until the last year, most of our projects were very nuanced, and each one of our agreements that we entered into with an emitter was different. Some asked for a turnkey solution, take their dirty flue gas, whatever it might be, build the capture equipment, build the transportation, and obviously handle the permanent storage, sequestration, monitoring, and of course all the associated perceived liabilities with that. So we call that a wrap project now, and we have quite a few wrap projects where an emitter realizes, hey, for whatever reason, internal or otherwise, we can discuss those sort of drivers that they want us to handle everything. Then there's quite a few emitters now. A lot of greenfield projects that we've entered into, blue ammonia projects are one of the big examples where they just want to give us dry compressed flue gas. They give us the composition that they anticipate, or for high concentration like agricultural products, they know precisely what they've got as far as CO2. So we call that a TNS contract. It's a service contract for pure transportation and sequestration of the CO2, and so it varies. So each one of them, the projects look a little bit different, and even to go as far as just utilizing one of our development sites that we built on a merchant basis based upon the zip code, i.e. there's a lot of emitters around, so we've developed, we're 2 Class 6 permits done, and hopefully a third one, they keep telling me, in this building in the next 60 to 90 days, 2 of which we did on a pure merchant basis. So one of those, we will not handle the the transportation. We will just be paid a fee for sequestering it, and the variables there depend a lot on the volume and the duration of the agreements. 45Q is currently 12 years, but we're seeing folks, certain types of industries, wanting 20 with 2 5-year extensions, potentially a 20, and we just negotiated a term sheet today for a 30-year sequestration project. So that affects a lot of the cost, the capex of that, if you're going to have different CO2 sources. So really long-winded question. I know I'm going to end up running out of time if I keep answering them this long.
No, very good. Thanks, Charles. Okay. So next we wanted to touch on economic incentives. So Verde is generally in the position, of being the operator, the off-taker. So you're talking with carbon emitters all of the time. So
Right.
When you talk with these emitters, what are they saying about, key economic drivers? What do they need to see to move forward on a project? And last question is how they're going to be maximizing value.
Yeah, so we'll set aside the 45V versus 45Q for some emitter kind of discussion for today, but obviously 45Q is what separates us from all other countries, and we talk a lot about the European Union and Canada and other project areas, but 45Q is the big driver, especially post Inflation Reduction Act. So that's obviously who earns those, and those obviously vary on the different type of agreements we discussed, or I mentioned a moment ago. Voluntary credits are those, it's really an evolving market. They've been around. There are some well-established voluntary credit verifiers, and there are some, as they call, cowboy credits that are a little less valuable. But voluntary credits are one of them. We mentioned earlier, fuel cell transportation fuel that meet certain standards under CARB requirements for LCFS under the Innovative Fuel Standards Act is a real driver for a lot of projects. Now the LCFS market has declined, if you've watched it all in the last year and a half, considerably. I think it's about 50% of what it was before. one thing that we don't have on this slide is some emitters, like power producers, are a perfect example. Mostly natural gas cogen power plants. We can talk about coal later if you choose, if we want to. But in certain regions, under certain utility commissions, in different governmental agencies, power producers can enter into a power purchase agreement with a commercial utilizer of those electrons, and they can get a premium for those electrons. And we're seeing that. We're negotiating an agreement right now with a power company that is already identified and negotiated a PPA subject to successful sequestration of the CO2. So that's another incentive. And then obviously just shareholder relations and stakeholder relations. All major companies have made some sort of commitment to decarbonize, and that's one of the big drivers. And that will result in public companies, we believe, like the Denbury effect, right? Denbury, before it sold, traded at a much higher multiple to all of its peers because of its perception and because of its actuality of CCS involvement. So that's another driver for public companies.
Great.
Were there other questions in there that I missed, Megan? You can't ask me these multifarious questions, you know.
I know, I'm sorry. I was going to say.
I remember that phrase from law school. It was like one of the objections I can remember, but.
That's true. I think that you hit them all though. So we can move on to the next.
Sure.
So there are obviously a number of industries that are carbon heavy. We had mentioned a few here: steel, chemicals, cement, hydrogen, power generation, just to name a few. So what are the most targeted industries, and how do you think that they're benefiting from CCS?
Sure. I mean, I think right now the most challenged, it all comes down to concentration of CO2 in the flue gas. And several of these can be lumped together. High concentration is by far the most coveted project to have. You'll see that from ammonia to agricultural products, et cetera. Those projects, and that includes, like, you've got hydrogen here, and ammonia that comes from that, are high concentration. Well, the economics there are solid, and even under the current IRA, without voluntary credits, without potentially any other incentives, financial incentives for a developer like ourselves, and for the company that is the emitter company, it's their, the phrase is overused, but their prior trash or CO2 is now a treasure. And so those are by far probably the most coveted. Steel and cement we are been working on steel and cement projects for a couple of years now, and are in feed on two of those, each one of those types of industries right now. They are lower concentration, but they're not as low as a natural gas power plant. Some of the steel and cement is in the high teens, most of it's single digit, but then you get to power generation. The most cost effective, and I believe should have been invested more in and should invest, is coal-fired power plants, because it's a replete natural resource, creates a ton of CO2 and NOx and SOx, and we can capture it. And EPCs and capture companies like Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, and I'm not trying to plug them versus Kiewit versus anyone, they'll give us a performance guarantee. The feed study may cost $10, $12, $15 million to get through, and that EPC wants to actually build it. But the economics are fantastic. Because what's $1 billion to $2 billion, depending on the size of the power plant, there's so much CO2 that it's fantastic as far as the economics. And you've got this replete natural resource that employs tons of folks in the coal industry. The problem we at Verde have run into is our financial partners don't want to be around coal. It's it's got a target on its back, which is sad, but it's true. So we have focused on natural gas and cogen power plants, which are very challenged from an economic standpoint, without any other additional, like the increased power purchase agreement prices. So we have to focus, we have to be really lean, we have to be very efficient in our setting up of a sequestration field. Our source to sink needs to be really close. We've got to always find some little driver that makes those work. So they're not as sought after, which I like from a personal standpoint. Means I don't have my good friends at Exxon and Chevron really chasing those right now. much. Yeah, I think we're going to crack the code there. We've got a couple projects that we're moving forward on right now that make sense because we were able, because of geography, to locate a sink, a source with one pore space owner, been able to negotiate and explain to them, look, we can't inject unless our fee per ton is this price. And so we're moving forward on some right now with current technology. Meanwhile, quietly rooting for membrane technology and everyone else, all the new, but everything that we do at Verde is older technology. None of it's Star Wars. I think our first CO2 injection well was drilled in 1979 in Scurry County, Texas. So we have to use very expensive chrome tubulars, but it's not anything we haven't done before. Back to the first question I think you asked me was, oil and gas professionals and the drilling folks here, who I can't say enough fantastic things about, two of which ran enhanced oil and gas recovery fields through water floods and then CO2 floods. And so these are the type of wells we've drilled in the past.
So you just spoke a little bit about, what kind of emitters are being targeted and everything, but would you say that there are particular industries that are getting the best benefit?
Yeah, those high concentration folks. I mean, there are arrangements that we have where used to be where we anticipated they were paying us for us to take away their CO2 if we did the capture equipment, or if they were capturing in that case. We have scenarios whereby we're paying for a dirty flue gas because the economics make sense because of the volume. So yeah, it is a each one of them have their own, but yeah, no question, ammonia is probably sort of the golden child right now. Any high concentration source. And a great thing about a lot of these greenfield projects that are being announced, from hydrogen to ammonia to others, are they're building capture equipment in the same process, knowing it from the get-go, which, wow, that's far more efficient than taking a power plant and then having to retrofit or build next to it a capture island with cooling towers, et cetera. Obviously, that's just sort of economies of scale. And then also with the brownfield projects, we have to be very cognizant of how long is this, what's the industry itself? Is the industry long lived? Obviously, we're going to need steel and cement forever, but does the plant, does the furnaces, do the equipment themselves, or the power plant, when are they scheduled to be decommissioned? So when the smart finance folks in the other part of the building go through and look and build a financial model, it makes a huge difference if the plant's gonna, they will do a bi-directional take or pay, firm commitment. We're going to take all your CO2 from this plant and draw a box around it, but you're going to commit that you're giving us X volumes of CO2 per year for so many years. So these greenfield projects, they want to go 30 years, 25 years, 20 years at least, regardless of what 45Q says right now. And a lot of them can avail themselves to 45V and other incentives.
Great, thanks. Okay.
Cool graphic, I like it.
Oh yeah, thank you. So the next thing that we wanted to talk about is that, the US has been at the forefront of developing and implementing these projects, but it's not just US companies participating. So can you speak to what role foreign investment is playing here and what you think is driving that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. We obviously in the United States were a leader because of 45Q. I think I mentioned it earlier, and because there was no way for European, Canadian, other types of companies, Australia, Japan originally, to ever monetize there. So you saw the early movement in CCS here in the US. Now and again, I have to rely on smart lawyers to walk through and explain the carbon border adjustment mechanism, but carbon taxes by various parties, cap and trade in Canada, like cap and trade in California, but those are a driver now for foreign investment. You see along the Gulf Coast and on the Pacific Coast where products that are going to be shipped out are going to be taxed based on their carbon intensity. So that's making a big driver in U.S. projects as well, and I assume in in Europe and in other countries. Where you see that also, frankly, is a lot of these projects, what I was just talking about, these blue ammonia projects. And I hate color intensity, by the way. The green and blue throws me off, and don't get me started on green electrons, because I'll take up all of the 45 minutes we have. But what you see is a lot of investments. Obviously, there've been some big public announcements by Equinor, by foreign entities that want to participate in projects themselves. But what a lot of folks don't realize is there's a lot of foreign dollars that are actually building all these hydrogen plants on the Gulf Coast, the ammonia plants, to ship ammonia to South Korea for coal-fired power plants, to burn the ammonia with the coal-fired power plants to meet their own either national or corporate directives. And so we're seeing an influx of investment dollars come in, international oil and gas companies that either operate or on U.S. soil or don't want to operate on U.S. soil, but want the benefit of having invested and being able for their own corporate directives to be involved in projects in the United States. We see that with not only foreign oil and gas companies, but with foreign financial institutions as well. And it's really changed the landscape, at least when it comes to post FID, for sure. Okay. Final investment decision. So pre-FID, not so much. They still rely on us to carry the heavy load. But once you have an emitter agreement, you have your Class 6 well application, at least fully deemed with no notices of deficiencies from the UIC, the EPA, or the state agency if primacy has been granted. Those are sort of the initial thresholds. And once you have those, there's a lot of foreign dollars looking to invest.
Got it. Well, to move from transatlantic to a little more regional in the US, so there's been significant investment in CCS in the Gulf Coast region for a number of reasons. And I'm acknowledging that I'm asking an intentionally leading question, but is that the only region with appropriate geology for CO2 storage? What other regions do you think are ripe for that development?
Well, it's definitely not the only region. There's a couple of reasons why. The Gulf Coast, and I'm not tooting the Gulf Coast because I happen to be sitting in Houston, and we have from Brownsville all the way into Baton Rouge projects, and now looking at a project in Mississippi. Yes, the Gulf Coast is replete blessed with great geology. And we have, from a geologic stage, from Miocene, Oligocene to Frio, we have multiple zones that we're able to inject well below the confining zone, but well above an overpressured regime of like 10,000 feet. Sometimes we have 6,000 to 7,000 feet of injectable zones that we can perforate and inject in the lowest zone for years, a year or two, however many years is appropriate based on the lease size, based upon other wells, the area of review, which is a pressure change. We have those which are great, and then coming up hole and doing it again and again and again. Well, there's also fantastic geology in New Mexico, the Entrada Formation, but there's 3 zones there, right? So if you have 9 in Corpus Christi, outside of Corpus Christi, Texas onshore, and you have 3, you need 3 times as much pore space as far as acreage. Typically, it's not a 1-for-1 analysis, but it's pretty similar. We are right now developing a project in Arkansas with a power plant, and it's a medium-sized natural gas power plant that has been able to enter into a preliminary contract for a power purchase agreement. We searched high and low, and we found pore space that's injectable. Obviously, not enough seismic out there, so we'll be having to shoot seismic. But we anticipate, and we've worked with University of Texas BEG and LSU. We anticipate about 120-foot zone to inject in. Well, it's great. I mean, we can inject in that, but we're going to need a lot more. We're going to need a lot more pore space. By rule of thumb, 1,000 acres on the Gulf Coast can handle roughly 1 million tons a year, 750,000 tons to 1 million tons a year before you need to go up hole and do it again to keep your plume and your area review similar. I mean, none of it's symmetrical. In Arkansas, we're going to need a lot more acreage because it's just one zone that we're never going to perforate. Now, the beauty part about that is it's shallower and there's plenty of confining zone. I think 300 feet is what the EPA requires. Here we're looking at closer to 400 or 500 to where in Texas, Some places we have 900 feet of thick shale rock that is impenetrable. So, yeah, the Midwest, there's so many great ammonia plants out. Keep in mind, in Illinois is where the first Class 6 well was ever granted at the ADM power plant, or ADM facility there. So there's definitely not the geology in certain parts of the country. California has some good geology, not as good as the Gulf Coast, but some good solid geology. The problem with California, beyond the regulatory environment there, which can be a little more challenging unless you're in like Kern County, Bakersfield or something like that, which is not as complicated, is the fractional ownership of the surface, which is where obviously pore space rights generally reside. So putting together a land position sufficient to, when there's no pooling, inject CO2 is complicated. So I think right now what we've got low-hanging fruit in the Gulf Coast, and that is two-part. It's the geology and it's the CO2 emissions, because of the Gulf of Mexico and all the industries that ship products to and from the Gulf Coast. You have just tons of CO2 emissions that need to be put away. We have some great geology there that at some point we're going to fill up, and it's going to be. We're blessed to have kind of gotten out of the blocks in the CCS business a little bit early. We were country before country was cool, and I won't sing it on this presentation. It's really embarrassing, but we've leased some great pore space, but at some point we're going to fill it up. And New Braunfels, Texas, in central Texas, doesn't have the geology, so we have to figure out a way to take cement plants from New Braunfels to a different place. And West Texas is good. So the geology changes, but you also have to keep in mind the geography of the CO2. That source to sink matching can kill a project, and kills most projects.
Got it. Yeah, I was going to ask, aside from the geology, what differentiates regions, if it's just the regulatory landscape or if there are other considerations.
I think most of the states of the union, we're in 5 states right now. Most of them are very receptive. California a little more challenging. We had 2 projects there. We've not killed at all. In fact, we really like them. They're just not a high priority. Most of the other states, regulatory environments, even New Mexico. Michelle Lujan Grisham was just this big proponent of a hydrogen hub, and that's why we spent so much time there with the Entrada formation with her office. But the geography of the CO2 is a big deal, and it kills a lot of projects when you have to haul CO2, build a brand new pipeline. Now, obviously, the luxury of like Denbury Exxon now, great transaction for Exxon, is that green pipeline and all the pipelines they already had for CO2. And so for a new developer or a company that doesn't have an existing CO2 line, even with right-of-way, which and watching this traditionally most right-of-ways are product specific. So you got to go negotiate a new right-of-way. The distance kills projects. Pre-IRA, we used to say, depending on a one-to-one, a bespoke project where we had an emitter transmission line, we were going to build to a sequestration site that was built either for that or for that and other sites. It was like, we can go 20 miles, 25 miles. Now we've gotten a little more gutsy. And then now that we're seeing more foreign investment that wants things to go 20, 30 years, you can go even further because your financial model says, hey, that expenditure can still give me that kind of mandatory IRR that we need for the pipe to make sense.
Right. So if a company has issues arise with their geological considerations, is that the end of the line? I assume that you're going to be seeing more co-location for emitters. If you want to tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. These hubs are fantastic concepts. It was just hub. I always kind of envision it like a train stop in Texas or a subway stop in New York. It's a pipeline that you can put CO2 on wherever and take off wherever, and just transfer molecules that way. No, it's not. There's not a part of this country where it won't ultimately make sense. And I think at some point, the the General Land Office of Texas has done some offshore leasing. I think those are going to be developed. Fantastic sites, not by Verde, but some of the big leases are going to take place, but those require a considerable capex and opex associated with it. But at some point, we're going to fill up some of the easier, lower hanging fruit. So I wouldn't shy away from any industry There's our original hit rate was about 2 to 3% of every project we looked at. And no project ever died. We just kind of put it on the shelf for a while. Post-Inflation Reduction Act, things have come up. Now we're entering into JVs. We've got a JV with a very large midstream company who's committed to building a large trunk line capable of moving 20 million tons a year. So that all of a sudden there's some projects that that we had put on the shelf that we're bringing back live because of that trunk line. It enables us to move to one of our sites. Obviously the economics of that will change significantly. The first, commitments that you make in might be more expensive, but we're generally negotiating most favored nation provisions. As the lines fill up, our rates will come down, kind of being the first user of those. So.
Yeah, great. Okay, so let's take a step back and give a little recap. We've talked about the CCS projects, emitter roles, the geography, geology. So I was hoping that I could throw out some hypothetical emitters and ask for your thoughts on how they might best structure their own CCS project.
Okay.
So first, let's say, for example, we had a cement producer with post-combustion, low CO2 emitter, and they don't want to own or operate the CCS equipment. They don't really particularly care about receiving the tax credits. They just need to decarb. They want to spend as little money as possible. So what advice would you give to them on the project style?
Yeah, that's just a wrap contract, and you picked one in an industry that's not hypothetical for me to answer, because and by the way, for anyone who is watching this, we didn't prep that cement question. It just happened to be perfect. Now, seriously, the cement is one of those, and we've seen a move. Let me pause. Emitters keep changing. I mean, they all have their own drivers, right? And we talked about those. And some of the times it's stock price, sometimes it's their board. We as a company really in 21 saw a lot of companies coming in and getting directives post Paris Accord saying, hey, we're going to decarbonize. And they thought, hey, we are awesome at building some or whatever steel. We are great at our business, and we can build capture equipment. We hire Kiewit, we hire MHI, we'll build it and operate it. And some of them went as far as to hire their own geoscientists and look at their own property underneath, et cetera. What we saw at Verde, especially as a company that doesn't have a good housekeeping seal of approval originally, hopefully we do now, but that no one knew who Little Verde was. And I quote Little Verde from an article written, but it was the issue became, hey, we don't want the liability. They did not want the liability of the geologic liability. What if it comes back up whole? We're not used to dealing with this, managing a contract drilling operator, et cetera. Kind of getting away from your question, Megan, forgive me. But what we've seen in the last 2 years is a move from folks wanting to do the capture themselves, and some handle all the way through and have us Verde as a consultant, to, okay, we can build the capture equipment. We want you to do a TNA, a service agreement to take it away. To, all right, we're back to our original plan. We're at a place where now we want you to do it all, but we'd like to have an ownership interest in it. And that's another point we've not talked about, is that creates great alignment for us. But generally they want to have ownership in the capture equipment and maybe the transmission, but most of our emitter partners that we've signed that have an ownership interest and have invested dollar for dollar with us in the capture equipment, or starting with the feed study, they don't want the liability. Their board doesn't want the liability of downhole liability, the MRV plan, the entire thing. So to your example, there's a cement, there's several, so I don't have to name one. There's, I think, 6 cement plants in New Braunfels, Texas area, and we've got one that we're negotiating with right now, and it's a full wrap. And now the board said, hey, we wouldn't mind having an ownership interest now that they've seen this, so we are discussing that. But we will gladly at Verde meet with a company and pay for it all. We have a very strong balance sheet and very strong financial partners that give them the financial assurances that Verde is going to be here to operate the capture equipment, to operate the transmission lines. Frankly, we partner with some of the larger midstream companies to build and operate most of those for us. We have only a few that we're doing on our own. Frankly, because that's not what we have done every day. We've run gathering systems, but that's a specialty to the pure sequestration. So we sign a contract with them that has financial penalties, but there's no, if a company wants to decarbonize, they don't want to spend their own money. Some of the times, high concentration, it might be a couple $100,000 or a couple $100 million to dehy and compress a high concentration stream with a little bit of separation to high single digits or low teens, might be $1 billion, and they just don't want to do it. And a lot of these companies have strong balance sheets. But some of the power plant companies, for instance, their board of directors needs them to retain their funds. It's been described to me for hurricanes, outages, tornadoes, depending on where their weather conditions might be, and so they don't want to outlay the money for the projects themselves. So
Right.
we will do them all, and we gladly will. I mean, if I had to pick, we would like to do it all, but frankly, just getting CO2 in the ground safely is the #1 goal, and meeting all of our social and environmental justice initiatives. So those two things have led us to the service, I'll call it, the service contractor. Just, hey, give us your dry compressed CO2 and we will transport it and sequester it away.
Perfect. Okay, one more hypothetical for you.
All right, I'm here.
So what if an emitter is okay with some capital outlay in exchange for retaining the credits and the other environmental attributes? What would you suggest to them?
Yeah, that's definitely can be negotiated. A lot of folks need all the credit, all of the, let's set aside dollars for a moment. Hard to do, but let's set aside dollars. But we're talking about the environmental credits and the attributes that they get. They need to decarbonize for that. That's fine. We've negotiated those as well. There's many levers to pull to make sure that everyone has a positive project one way or another, and that has not been a problem. There's a methanol project that they needed the credits. That wasn't on the table. We were going to build the capture equipment. They wanted to have an ownership in the capture equipment, did not want to own anything after the gate of the capture equipment. And so, like I said, there's a lot of levers to pull, and smarter lawyers and business folks than myself have been able to explain to me how we're doing it. I'm just the one who's blessed to get to sign on the dotted line at the end. But no, those negotiations are unique in and of themselves, because no two companies are in the same position, obviously. Yeah.
Right. Perfect. So one thing that we haven't discussed yet in detail is timing. So if a company goes with a turnkey arrangement, how long will it take them to go from, the initial approval to actual CO2 being injected into the ground?
The biggest driver, you've got 3 components. The biggest driver generally for low concentration is going to be the capture equipment, long lead items, the feed study, etc. By the time we've picked a site, we've acquired seismic. Sometimes several $1 million, sometimes it's $750,000 if it's 5,000 acres, something like that. We really focus on only injectable acreage because we're private. We don't take 20,000, 30,000 acres swath of land with old well bores that the EPA is going to have problems with, where there's a salt dome and there's radiating faults through the confining zone. We really worry about containment. So many of our leases are in Texas, for instance, or in New Mexico. One was a much larger tract of land, but we told the landowner we only want this 5,000 acres. So by the time we've acquired the acreage, we've already done months and months, if not half a year or more, of geologic analysis by geologists and geoscientists here. We've acquired seismic, loaded it up in-house, built a static model. We generally don't move to a dynamic model until we've acquired the lease, but by then we've acquired it. And so we're on our 3rd Class 6 well application. Each one's different. I'm not saying it's a rinse and repeat, but we're getting much more efficient. We thought originally we could get our first application done. We actually hired the former head of the EPA UIC. We brought in third-party, help as well. And I sat there in office. It was like, we should be done in 4 months. Well, it wasn't the employees' fault. It was the modeling kept changing. The inputs kept changing. But now I think we're at a stage, if we've been in the ballpark, if we've been within 50 to 100 miles on another site, we could pretty much, once that dynamic model is done, get an application in to the EPA deemed administratively complete without any NODs or notices of deficiency in about 4 to 6 months. The EPA has been citing for quite some time, 2 years from start to finish. I think we have very clean applications. So you're at like what, 24 months, and by the way, that is to give you an authorization to construct the injection well. Okay, that's the gold standard right there, because then all you have to do is drill the well. You run some bond logs, you run a series of tests, you turn in all of your drilling reports, and the EPA says, yeah, you did it like you said you were, you can inject. So that's it. So we're call it 24 plus, call it 30 months. The capture islands got to take a lot longer to build. And it all depends on your industry. If I'm a company, I mean, if it is a company that has a high concentration, we know it's D-high and compression, mostly some slight separation, that equipment might be built in 9 months to a year. And then it comes down to the right of way. So the right of way, the construction, the feed on the pipeline itself. Again, most of these projects we're hoping are 5 miles to 10 miles away, but we have sites between, like for instance, the Port of Houston and Beaumont, Port Arthur, and so we have sites along the way, and the line can get built slowly over time. I know that was a ridiculously long answer, but I can't just blanketly say it's going to take this much time. I would say 30 months to 36 months on the site from signing the lease to an authorization to construct and inject. But the feed study for the capture equipment and the feed study on the pipeline sometimes might take longer.
Great. Yeah, that's perfect. So I think that we have time for one more question, and this one will be a surprise to you because we haven't spoken about it yet. So I was just wondering if you could speak to how scaling and refining the capture equipment technology might make CCS more broadly available.
Yeah. But like I said, we're rooting for all types of new technologies. Right now, so many of our projects are kind of razor thin, and we have to build contingencies in on costs and drilling, et cetera. And with those contingencies, they're razor thin. So as to new technologies, they're coming. There's so many great technologies out there. I could name a bunch of folks that are in sort of the early pilot stage, and they're capturing a little bit of CO2. And we're leaning in on some of those right now. From a capture perspective, but scale changes everything as well. In certain areas, it's hard unless it's the same industry, and that rarely exists, where you can build like one capture island for different sources. That's kind of rare. But like I mentioned, there's 5 or 6 cement plants in New Braunfels, Texas, and just because of the natural resources there to make cement. So that makes it there's 5 or 6 million tons of CO2 there with all the plants. At 500,000 tons to build one capture island, even if you can put some together, but to build the pipe to get to the appropriate place is not it's not financially viable. But scale makes a big difference. That's why these hubs are so fantastic. You see the big announcements by Oxy and Exxon and the others. And like I said, we have ours that we've not announced we've had for a year and a half. While right of way has been taken, which is kind of key. Don't usually make an announcement until you have your right of way. So we're working through those, but these hubs and the scale of CO2 makes it costs the same amount for us to drill a well, but it doesn't. The big variables are the pipe and the capture equipment.
Great. Well, I think we're about out of time, so I just wanted to thank you again, Charles, so much for your time and for sharing your insight about the industry. It's been really great.
Well, thank you for having me, Megan, and I appreciate being invited to this panel.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.